Testing. Okay, great.
All right.
Yes.
Yes. Do you want them to see you or your presentation?
I think it's okay. I don't think people in the room will see me.
And they can also switch to that picture.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Is it possible to move a little bit to the front because it's quite a big room? For those who are at the back, maybe we could fill some spaces here at the front before we start. Sorry. All right. Okay. All right. So I tried.
Yeah, super nice people, and it makes it much easier to talk. Yeah,
Okay. All right. So welcome everyone. Welcome to today's workshop session, or rather panel session. I'd just like to get a read of the room before we begin, just to know who is in the room. Any students here? Just raise your hand. Students, please. Okay, all right. Early career, one who would mention themselves as an early career scientist also. I think that also okay. And fully fledged scientists, people who have been in the research arena for a long time. I think I see a couple of people. Okay. Implementing partners, any first people from organizations, representing organizations in the room? Okay, all right, great. Any donors? Okay, all right, great. So we have a good mix of people. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll be talking about trees, people, and choices in fragile situations. And this is quite a timely topic, very relevant and critical in today's world. And my name is Immaculate Ida, and I'll be moderating today's session. So just let's talk a little bit about the topic at hand. And Anya yesterday really brought us brought the topic in together when she talked about trees, the benefits that trees bring into the ecosystem, and also the effect that it has on the livelihoods and also ecosystem restoration. But today we really want to complement that, and there's lots of literature around trees. But today we really want to complement that and go a little bit in depth into the social science aspect, looking at choices that people make in fragile contexts. And we know that fragility is not really a singular challenge, but it's a multifaceted concept. We have fragility coming from environmental sources, environmental degradation. We have fragility coming as a result of political instability. We also have natural disasters, and we also have social inequities. But at the same time, all these dimensions, they don't act in isolation, but they intersect, creating vulnerabilities that really deeply influence the choices that people make under these situations. And again, in this fragile context, the decision-making is also a little bit complex because it involves multiple actors at different levels. So we have actors at household, individual, local communities, governments, and institutions. And they're also acting at different levels. We have regional, we have national, and we also have community levels. And each of these actors are also acting with their own, they have their own needs, they have their own aspirations, they have their own constraints, which also need to be taken into consideration. So, and all these decisions create complex path dependencies. And it's really important for us to understand how these complex interrelated paths that we as researchers, practitioners, students, early career scientists, we need to understand all these complexities if we are going to design resilient and projects that actually support the adaptive capacity of these individuals. So the central question then is, do we understand decision-making in fragile contexts well enough to intervene effectively? And to build the resilience, we definitely need to grasp the why behind people's choices. What drives decisions in environments where resources are scarce? There's a lot of unpredictability, there's a lot of risks involved. Political systems are also unstable, or conflict and also disasters are frequent. And how can we also want to delve, how can we, or currently, how are we designing solutions that not only address immediate vulnerabilities, but also align with long-term aspirations? And so, to help us really unpack this a little bit further, we have 5 speakers who will talk about different aspects, different perspectives, or rather offer the different perspectives around this angle. They're working in different degrees of fragility, and they'll cover the full spectrum of decision-making challenges. So we'll start off with Kai, who will kind of delve into why aspirations should guide resilience building. And then we'll move into key decision factors in adoption, what really matters. And then following that, Mary Crossland will lead us into the realm of intra-household decision-making and ecological farming. And then Alex Awiti will take us into the tough realities of decision-making in areas that are confronted with conflict and disasters. And then Michael now will talk about purpose-driven choices during ecosystem rehabilitation in fragile situations. So as the speakers present, so we'll do a round of speakers speaking about all these aspects. And as they speak, let's reflect and think about all the themes that are being raised, and we'll engage actively during the Q&A session. Thank you very much. So now I'd like to introduce Kai, who will start us off with aspirations. Kai. Yes.
Thank you, Immaculate. I hope everybody can hear me. Don't like standing, so welcome. I wanted to talk about our work on household aspirations and how that relates to resilience building. So as Immaculate outlined, it's resilience is in different contexts is a complex construct, and people relate to interventions in these areas differently. And when looking at aspirations, social resilience or social cohesion is one of the factors that we look into as a different dimension of resilience building. We initially started looking at aspirations, understanding that depending on the household livelihood portfolio, agricultural interventions, initially in ICRAF, groundnut varieties and the like, and now at ICRAF in relation to trees and other more complex farming systems, relate to people's current realities differently, and what they are planning to get out of their current livelihood portfolios, or where they want to go with that, would be critical to understand for us to design interventions in line with that. So we simply asked them, how would your life look like in 10 years' time? What do you want to achieve in the future? And ask them to assess these short narratives around their aspirations along several concepts. Some of them I will show later, others we have to skip for today. So we went to different geographies to also make sure to cover the different realities. This was in Turkana, Makueni, and Meru in Kenya. So significantly different biophysical conditions. And the levels of opportunities and the confidence was one of the assessment criteria. It's to anyone who has been in Turkana, the levels of opportunities as reflected by the people here are pretty limited. And I think no one would disagree with that. It's harsh. Yet they are pretty confident to achieve what they aspire to, which also tells us that the aspirations are not just pipe dreams and completely out of the blue, but they are grounded in current realities. Further, depending on the situation you're currently in, the drivers of why you want to go where you said you want to go, they are different. They are to an extent determined by the current geographical opportunities, but there is significant distributions underneath that are important to understand as well. As it's not just because you're in a region, everybody wants the same, but things are much more diverse. And the social relations is one of those, especially conflict. This is actually a different sample. Sorry for the confusion. This is from Northern Benin. So the conflict situation that people are facing to an extent in Turkana, it's likely the same, but we haven't asked that question in that context. So people's drivers and motivations shift with conflict emerging. That's an important factor, especially when you go after social resilience. But so where working together or working alone as a success factor shifts with the emergence or absence of conflicts. Then there's the more and more prominent question on how youth relates to our interventions. And along the lifespan, which is partly path dependency, people get more and more interested in agriculture, while young people look more outside farming, which is sort of the general preconceived notion, but that doesn't imply that they want to leave the rural sites. They're just looking at other opportunities, but would prefer to remain within their current geographies and social relations that they're in. I think I'll skip that. So when considering aspirations in your project, it's actually important. It shifts the sort of what we call target group in the past. If we have an agricultural intervention and half of the population isn't interested or doesn't aspire to be in agriculture, that should drive the way we communicate our projects and the way we approach communities with our projects, rather than trying to sell it to everyone. Not everyone is interested. So we are wasting a lot of time and could design corresponding interventions that would bring the rest of the communities in. I think I'll leave it for there, and the rest we can feature in the discussion later. So over to Mary for the next bit. Well, no, I can start. As you can see, this is not Mary.
Hi, I'm Mary. No. Yeah, that looks good. All right, good morning, everyone. So now I'm going to tell you what really matters. No, I'm not. This is just clickbait, but I'm glad you all made it here. This is what we do to fill the room. No, what I want to well, basically start off from is this idea of decisions and decision makers that we keep hearing about a lot. There's some, we always talk about it, but sometimes we don't really manage to connect our work very well to decisions. And we also sometimes work on things that may or may not matter for decisions, and we often don't really know. So this is essentially what I want to talk about and present a research approach that was actually started at ICRAF. One of the organizations hosting us here today, where I worked for quite some time. which is decision-focused research. So we actually have a research approach that focuses on these decisions we're all talking about for particular reasons. One reason is that, well, decisions, especially in fragile contexts, are super critical, but also decisions are absolutely essential for our pathway, for all of us, the work we all do. We all have these ambitions of changing the world, making the world a little bit better. And if you realize that, if you think about it, the pathway from your research to the real world impact we want pretty much always involves decisions that somebody makes in some context. Can be a farmer, can be a politician, can be, I don't know, or uncle, and anyone really. Yeah? Somebody has to do things differently, make a decision that actually changes the course of the world and allows our research to reach the scale that maybe we want to reach. And there's a common mismatch between what researchers produce and what decision makers need. Yeah? I think if we all kind of deeply reflect about what we're doing and how directly this I don't know, matters for somebody making a decision, we realize often this doesn't really totally connect. Huh? And so this is quite common. And this is why a while ago, actually 2012 or something, Keith Shepard, my former boss, who's retired now at ICRAF, had this idea of why don't we look at how people actually study decisions and try to apply this for agricultural research. So we work with people who do something called decision analysis, and this is essentially the starting point for what I'll be talking about here now. So what we do is we don't necessarily try and understand everything that goes on in the agricultural systems. Huh? I mean, we're all fascinated by agriculture, and we know there's all these little questions that are worth exploring, and we could dig deeper and deeper into 1 cubic centimeter of soil and find all kinds of fascinating things. But most of these things aren't so critical, and they don't really help us inform decision makers well. And so we actually started with decisions. And so we look for decisions that somebody actually wants to take, and we characterize and model these decisions. So what actually matters to this person? What matters to this decision? What determines whether it's a good decision or a bad decision? We then strive to grasp the full complexity of the context. So we make complicated diagrams with bubbles and arrows and all kinds of crazy things, and try to use all available sources of information that we have. So we're not going to necessarily have just a control block design trial or things like this. We actually try and grasp everything that we can find, including quite often expert knowledge. So we often have workshops that feature in our work in all kinds of different contexts, and really try to gather what people know about a decision that somebody's going to make. What's critical, and you do this because we don't have this robust scientific, again, block designed, statistically significant business that we all like doing. We critically consider uncertainties about it because it's not quite as kind of firm as we like our facts to be, as we imagine our facts to be. They actually aren't ever, if we really think about it. But we are very careful about capturing uncertainties because research can't fully eliminate these. There will always be uncertainties when somebody takes a decision. Yeah, I mean, even if there's data and we have all the data to base our decision on, we don't know what next year's weather is going to be. Yeah, and there's also this confidence interval that we always kind of nicely ignore. Yeah, we go kind of like working with averages and means and precise numbers and all this stuff. It's actually always a little bit fake if you're honest about it, and there's always uncertainty to consider. So we're trying to be very honest about this and try to quantify them. Yeah? So if we have a number or something that we're trying to measure, we can always add like some sort of confidence interval or probability distribution, things like this. So we do this very carefully and then produce results and model decision outcomes, predict decision outcomes using probabilistic simulations, which sounds like a bulky word, but it basically means using all kinds of precise, imprecise kind of fuzzy information and converting into some sort of fuzzy outputs. I don't want to go into too much detail here. If you have a question about it, I can try. But we kind of get to something like this. This is a prediction of the outcome of a decision. And we can't totally say if it's a good decision or a bad decision. There are positive possible outcomes and negative ones. And we can be honest about it. We don't know if it's a good idea. Anything can happen. Huh? So this is essentially the kind of thing. Yeah? So basically, in such a situation, we'd say we can't tell you, but maybe there's some other questions we can ask and some information we might need to help you tell this better. Quite crucially, this allows considering factors that are difficult to quantify precisely. Yeah? Because if we give up the obsession with precision, all of a sudden we can enter things into our calculations that are a little bit difficult to quantify precisely. We can work with ranges and estimates and things like that. It becomes pretty interesting once you enter this space. It also allows us to consider risks quite nicely because decision makers face risks all the time, especially in these fragile contexts that we're talking about here. And we try to anticipate these and incorporate them into simulations. If you do a probabilistic simulation, basically often means that you run the model 10,000 times, and you can easily have an earthquake in 5% of these cases. Yeah. So it's actually makes it quite easy to consider these kind of things if you use these kind of techniques. Gives us realistic insights into the likely outcomes of decisions, and then hopefully some sort of guidance for a decision maker. And one of the nice things is we can avoid kind of best bet assumptions or overly optimistic assumptions. So, for example, in these tree planting business that these forest friends of the forest here like doing, yeah, we can of course always assume that all the trees will survive and farmers will be very well off, huh? But they won't. That's overly optimistic. Some will die. We don't know how many. So there's all these uncertainties that actually matter in real life for real life outcomes, and they should be considered when we do our work. A quick one, since we're talking about resilience and fragility here. Fragility of livelihoods and complex ecological systems is, of course, a result often of risks and uncertainties. I mean, this is essentially the core of fragility. And with our decision analysis magic, we can actually adequately represent these quite nicely in our work. And also the concept of resilience. It's actually, I mean, if you think about, or if you look at the definitions of resilience, it's kind of the response of, or it centers on the response of the system to shocks that might arise, to risks, essentially. Yeah? So somehow there is a kind of a hypothetical space we have to explore here. So we basically have to kind of map what kind of risks are there. We have to anticipate how a system responds. And we can very nicely do this with this decision analysis approach much better than we could ever hope to do this with a controlled trial or something of the sort. Yeah, so decision analysis is awesome for this. And one thing what I was really supposed to talk about here is what really matters. This approach allows us to prioritize research questions. Yeah? So, because if we actually, so what we try to do with these considering uncertainties is we're trying to base our work on the state of knowledge, on what we actually know. Yeah, and there are some things that we know very precisely and other things we know very approximately, maybe we have a lot of uncertainty about them. And once we do these calculations, we can actually then objectively look at, well, first of all, we can evaluate the impact on these uncertainties, on the decision outcomes. And so essentially we can use our program here that we have and basically objectively quantify which of these uncertainties are actually worth reducing. Yeah, so the thing for us in research is often that we have lots and lots of questions we could be asking, but most of them don't need to be asked because we already know a lot. Yeah. And we often find people kind of gravitating towards research questions that are easy to answer because we know how to answer them. For example, we can collect lots and lots of soil samples when really what a decision maker needs to know is something maybe completely different. The market price of some product or the risk of whatever, some sort of drought event or some things of that nature. So we have this concept here of the value of information that is basically takes all these uncertain inputs and looks at the outputs and relates them to each other, and basically gives us an indication of where we'd actually need a bit more research in order to help a decision maker in the best possible way. What you can take home here is a few things. A decision-focused research approach facilitates impact-oriented research. It offers tools, decision analysis offers tools to make this happen. Yeah, so we have this R package here that offers some of these things. We've published a few papers on this stuff as well. But there is really a world of literature on this decision analysis stuff, which very interestingly has found very, very few applications in agriculture so far. There's a huge space to explore. We only at the tip of the iceberg so far. Really, if you think about much of what we do in development-oriented research, it is really always focused on decisions. We're kind of struggling to inform these decisions, and there's a world of methods in this space behind this decision analysis keyword that I'd urge everybody to explore because it's super fascinating and useful. Probabilistic simulations, like we do them, enable a bunch of things. Meaningful resilience analysis, because we can play through lots of different future scenarios. Work in contexts that are characterized by fragility, because we can deal with uncertainties and risks that basically characterize a fragile system. and also objective characterization of knowledge needs for decision making. Yeah, so we can really, this is the what matters part again, we can find out what we should be working on in order to best inform a decision maker in any given context. Bit abstract, hopefully. How it does make sense. If you have more questions, we can hopefully get back to this in the discussion. Also, we can also set impact-oriented research agendas. That's another thing I want to say. And now it is actually time for Mary.
Yeah, that's the one. Okay, great. So, and let me just get myself set up. I'm Mary Crossland. I'm a scientist at CIFOR ICRAF, and I'm going to be talking about decision-making within households and why understanding these dynamics is really needed to build resilience, especially in the context of increasing male outmigration. So a slightly different focus, less quantitative, more qualitative, and looking within the household. And the specific case I want to focus on is that of Makueni County. So Makueni is located in the drylands of eastern Kenya. Farms are very small, land is very degraded, rainfall is becoming increasingly erratic. So very few households really rely solely on farming. Instead, a common strategy is to send a household member to look for work in urban centres to help support the family. And this work is usually non-seasonal, non-agricultural, for example, working in construction, working as a driver, or within security. These migrants typically go back home for a few days each month or during holidays. So they're not returning to specifically help on the farm during peak periods of the farming season. And now these internal migration dynamics and patterns have profound impacts on the structure and demographic of households. So we see women, children, and the elderly are often the ones remaining on farm, and these dynamics also influence decision making. And so the women that we speak to with migrant husbands and sons, they're not only taking on the farm labor, but they're also increasingly becoming farm managers. Okay, so these women are often having increased freedoms and control over the day-to-day management of their farms. So deciding what to plant, where to plant, and when. These women are often seen as the most knowledgeable about farming, and that's not just by themselves, but also others within their household. They're the ones on the farm, observing what's happening, and also often attending trainings on new agricultural practices. So this would seem to show that migration is opening up these opportunities for women in agriculture, but it's not quite so simple. Yes, women are getting greater agency over farming decisions, but that's not to say that they have control over the capital and resources needed to take action on those decisions. So male migrants are still very much involved in decisions, and they're often consulted on the phone, especially around decisions that require capital and long-term investments, so for example, tree planting. And this is because migrants are often the ones actually providing that capital through remittances that they send home. Now, I think this touches on an important takeaway for those of us working within research and development. We often assume that the adoption of innovations is quite a linear process. So a farmer attends a training, gains awareness, they then go home and try it out on their farm. But in reality, these decisions pass through this kind of filter of the household. So uptake decisions are discussed, they're negotiated with multiple household members, even those that might not be on the farm. Some of the women we spoke to also talked about the challenge of being able to persuade someone that a new practice is a good idea, especially when they haven't been involved in the training, they haven't seen the practice in action. So these findings indicate that it's not always the case that the most knowledgeable person has full agency to really implement those changes. And potentially the one least affected by shocks and stresses might not always be supportive. I also think we need to be very careful when we equate women's increased involvement in farming decisions with empowerment. So when we listen to women's stories about their lives following the migration of their household members, we hear stories of increased workload, responsibilities, but also that emotional strain of making decisions on your own, especially when it's the husband that migrates and you're being left to look after young children. Talking to younger women, we also heard that their life was especially difficult while living in households with their parents-in-law and having their husband migrate. And so in these situations, that migration actually led to a decrease in their involvement in farming decisions and decision-making power. So this is really just to highlight that those impacts of migration on decisions really varies with who leaves, but also that social position of those that remain on farm. And so the impacts won't be the same for all women of all ages and in the same situation. Okay, so what do we want you to kind of take away from this discussion? We've seen that male-out migration is creating the conditions for increased independence of women in this particular area in Kenya, but that this often comes with these increased stresses and responsibility, potentially without sufficient resources to actually act on those decisions. Those who are most knowledgeable and maybe hold the most interest in increasing the resilience of their farms might not have full control to actually implement changes. So efforts to increase resilience through, say, the uptake of agricultural innovations, we also need to be combining those with efforts to increase agency and kind of capacity around decisions. And so taking a slightly different approach to development through taking an intra-household perspective and recognizing that decisions are often discussed and negotiated could offer an avenue for this. I also think that approaches such as gender transformative approaches that really aim to shift and change the norms that underlie inequalities could also be a very promising avenue for such changes. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mary. Next we'll have Alex. Bye.
Good morning. I have nothing to show you, so sorry to kind of spoil the party, but it's a pleasure to speak at this event. And I'm going to try and get a sense out of the potential link between agroecology as a feasible kind of solution space for dealing with the risks of climate adaptation, climate mitigation. And of course, the kind of critical dynamics of climate-related disasters relate to human displacement, relates to conflict between human communities and human enterprises across from pastoral systems to sedentary agriculture. In parts of East Africa, we see conflict between humans and wildlife, for example, from pastoral communities that often compete with wildlife for grazing resources. So in East Africa, increasingly, I think over the, maybe about 10 years ago, we've had kind of historic record-breaking droughts that are billed as the most severe drought in 60 years, 40 years, etc. We just came out of an El Nino event, which was one of the most severe and protracted in recent memories. So we see these amplitudes of extreme climate events kind of increasing over time. And what these tend to do is that they intensify different kinds of resource scarcities. I'll give you a very quick example. The last El Nino of 1961 in the Lake Victoria Basin created enormous erosion in that fragile kind of lake plains that led to very severe deposits, overland flow that led to eutrophication of very shallow lake, just 90 meters. And that changed the ecological, biological structure of the lake with respect to fisheries. And part of what had happened historically was the introduction of the Nile perch by the British colonial government in the 1940s. So then you had severe decimation of the native fisheries varieties there. And then you had very anoxic and kind of light constrained conditions that then made it very difficult for the tilapia fisheries to breed. Then you see the entire dynamic of the fishery system change to one dominated by Nile perch and dominated by the small silverfish called Racionombola argentii, for example. Now that then changes the diet structure of those communities and changes the enterprise and economic opportunities around lakeshore towns. And we saw an entire collapse of several cities and small lake town cities in Tanzania, in Uganda, and in Kenya. And again, because of that enormous erosion event that happened from that El Nino event. So you can actually see how climate-related disasters can change the whole economic structures, change dietary structures. We saw severe elements of instances of protein malnutrition, for example, because the local fisheries that supported small business enterprise around fishing and also made it possible for households that are not as wealthy to afford a cheap source of protein. That's one clear example. Then again, what we see, especially in the areas that create and generate significant water productivity opportunity in these major landscapes, especially the Mau forest, for example, that feeds the charismatic Masai Mara ecosystem, Masai Mara, Serengeti, Amboseli, Tarangire, and all of that. All of that affects the dynamics of grazing, distribution of pasture and water resources. Again, with the amplification of drought events that come from human enterprises like deforestation and bad decisions by the governments to allow illegal logging, you create this very, very significantly diminished hydrological productivity of these landscapes, affects dry season base flow, affects pasture resources in the lowland savanna plains. So you can see all of these connections. And I think Idil made a very good point about the interconnectivity of all these things. So again, one of the fundamental failures of us as people working in this field is when you find an agronomist, they're stuck in the very small plot size at a farm level. When you find a forester, they're interested in a forest patch. How do we take a landscape view? How do we take this long-term ecological dynamics that are made possible only in the interconnectivity of the delivery of critical ecosystem services across an entire watershed, for example? Now, this is really how we start to build resilience. You can't build resilience for a household. It's just never going to work because those households are not totally isolated, kind of existing in total disconnection with the dynamics that produce the critical resources and livelihood opportunities that they need. So how do we start to think differently around education? I'm speaking at a university, I'm a recovering professor. So how do we start to change even the pedagogical dynamics? How do we change the epistemological dynamics of our engagement with students, that we don't train as narrowly as we do as agronomists, as ecologists, but we train system thinkers who begin to understand these kinds of dynamics in broader senses. So that's one element. The other one is governance and understanding that states and state capability is critical to driving resilience of entire societies. If governments fail, if governments make the wrong decisions, and Ike just talked about that we are all about decision making, but the path to approximating plausible, executable decisions is very tenuous, and it is not going to be straight. You need to bring in all kinds of intelligences, and sometimes we crash into the enormous limits of the scientific method. That we need other ways of understanding the world to be able to understand and navigate across these dynamics. So I want to suggest that state capacity is critical, but how do we ourselves trade in natural sciences, life sciences, for example, come into the space of understanding that governance is critical? And how do you make sure that how we speak and how we communicate connects with the immediate concerns and aspirations of decision makers, bureaucrats, who are constantly buffeted by mercantile interest, political competition, and bureaucratic inertia? How do we understand this thing? That they're not just looking at facts. You know, my country, for example, has a plethora of laws that are hugely enabling from an agroecological standpoint. But we have an insanely dysfunctional food system. So it's not a lack of evidence. And some of the colleagues in government are people that I went to school with, they're really educated. They're not stupid, but they're just not making the right decisions. So how do we understand the incentives that motivate politicians and bureaucrats to make the right kinds of decisions? And how do we as scientists go into these discussions sounding like they can relate to what we say? Not preaching at them, but trying to walk in their shoes and understand what it is that they're trying to do to achieve their aims. So agroecology, kind of boiled down to 13 principles, offers significant latitude for navigating these complex decisions. When you come from elements of understanding co-creation, embedding decision-making in communities, looking at the possibilities of engaging local societies and communities who are close to these resources to bring the best of their intelligence and folk understanding that has preserved these communities for generations before we even showed up to start to document and categorize this in different knowledge domains as we like to do. How do you start to look at some of the principles around natural resource governance and participation, for example? How do you start to look at life beyond the plot level to looking at landscape level governance that then enables kind of more engagement and participation, and also transdisciplinary approaches to understanding problem solving and decision making, for example. So I think in many respects, when you talk about agroecology, we are stuck at the agronomic level of these postulations. But we need to think about kind of landscape opportunities for interconnected governance and applying different kinds of intelligences to understand synergies across different enterprise opportunities at the landscape. You know, many years ago, and this story has stuck with me for all these years, when I was working for ICRAF at the time as a much younger scientist, we went into this community and we were all interested in soil and talking about erosion and how to, you know, demonize the upland communities for deforestation and creating overland flow that devastates the lower communities. And this young woman, this middle-aged woman just walked up to us and say, you know, this is not our problem. Our problem is that broken bridge, because we can't transport our dead and bury them. And here we were all consumed about why it is important to motivate kind of benign kinds of land practices that promote soil and water conservation. So how do we start to understand that communities make very complex decisions? And how do we begin to appreciate the connectedness of different kinds of portfolios that aggregate to create meaningful livelihoods for them? It is water, it is education, it is health, it is transportation, and yes, it is food. Food is important, and yes, biodiversity is important because they also depend on pollinators for their beings. But how do you create these kinds of conversations that elevate the discussion beyond the plot level? And this is where agroecology becomes a very powerful tool in terms of forcing interdisciplinary thinking and forcing us to work in broader spaces of disciplinary domains that are beyond what we know. So without belaboring the discussion on the imperative of agroecological approaches and agroecological thinking, I want to suggest that when we think about systems, it's important for us to really consistently have that mental image of a much broader, complex, connected landscape that has the farmer, has the landscape in that space, and has all these livelihood opportunities that engages their survival. And that governance and governance capability, especially state capacity, is important to deliver this. And how do we as scientists make sure that what we do connects to those immediate aspirations of politicians, but also at households beyond just, especially using the example that I just gave, that you hear talking about soil, but they want a bridge fixed. And how do you interface in those kinds of decisions? So I will shut up and stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alex. And finally, we have Michael. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Thank you, Immaculate. Welcome. You've just heard 4 presentations on decision-making and choices. Let me take this a step further and start by asking you, do you know your purpose? Do you know what you do? Why do you do what you do? Well, answers maybe, well, I want to graduate, no? I want a master's degree or doctor, become professor. I want to publish, I want to earn money. Maybe you want to help people, yeah, support community, green environment. That's what we're talking about here, you know, landscape and ecosystem restoration. So what I'm gonna do here, and think about this question, I asked this question myself. I can tell you now, it was damn difficult to find an answer, you know, what my purpose really is. Because it's the answer to the question, why are you doing something that matters to you? What is behind that goal that you run after? And in landscape restoration, that I'll talk about here, we set goals about acreages, then the area that we want to restore, who's getting involved, the type of trees that we choose. But why are we doing that? Now, I'll take you to probably one of the most challenging contexts, to Somalia. That's where I work, next to other parts on this countries in this planet. And what I'm going to present here is anecdotal. It's based on observations. It's conceptual. It's not empirical. So I'm taking a risk here. Yeah, I'm sharing my thoughts with you. You can chase me out of the room afterwards, or help me understand what I don't yet get. Now, I think purpose is important to understand decision-making and to guide decision-making and eventually choices for landscape restoration or ecosystem restoration. Why? Well, I took these pictures a few weeks ago, northern Somalia, bare soils, landscape, sky erosion. Alex, you mentioned this just now, like in Kenya, there's drought one year, there's actually flood the other year. So we're here to understand how to move from that kind of environment to that, yeah, a restored ecosystem. Yeah, it's in the same ecozone. Restored landscape, in that case, by communities themselves, even without researchers being there. I mean, I came in as a researcher because I saw green spots from the plane. I said, this can't be, because we are in the desert. So I said, take me out there. I want to see this, and found literally oases run by communities themselves. To make a living, and they obviously knew their purpose. Now, in ecosystem restoration partnerships, you know, many different players come together: NGOs, researchers, communities. And what we often don't do is to discuss that purpose. And I think that's also one reason why some of these initiatives don't fly beyond the duration of the program cycle and the finance. So, why purpose anyways? Well, the short answer is because there's an academic interest in it. Here, see, this is this is from Science Direct, data derived this year. The community talks about purpose-driven organizations, purpose-driven enterprises, businesses, and it's going upwards. You see, in the year 2000, just a handful of scholars who actually published on purpose as a topic, and that's gone up to 16,000. This year, 2024, we already exceeded the 2023 numbers when it comes to purpose. Now, I'm wondering whether there's something to learn from that scholarship for ecosystem restoration. And I think there is, because as I said, successful restoration is required. It's a multi-actor partnership amongst different people. At the moment, we work through environmental management groups in Somalia, so community-led restoration communities, but also humanitarian agencies. You know, and there's a bit of private sector involvement. All these entities, they tick very differently. Their purpose does not necessarily align. That's also why there are tensions sometimes in rolling such programs out. And I think purpose can help to navigate those diverse interests. So it's not only aspiration that looks into the future, a goal that one has that looks into the future, but it's really the why question that goes beyond that, the answer that goes beyond that. I think it's particularly challenging in conflict zones when you work with internally displaced persons who sometimes may have lost their purpose because they depend on food, on relief. Their immediate purpose is actually to stay alive. And I've witnessed this myself in work in Uganda. When we did visioning exercises, I asked myself, why can't we go beyond a year of vision and aspiration that goes beyond a year? Until colleagues told me, well, Michael, the families wouldn't know whether they are still there next year. Yeah. So that's how far an aspiration can go. And then that has implications for purpose. My hypothesis is, and I'm going to share a few research questions along those, is whether purpose-driven partnerships actually foster inclusivity and actually has positive implications for the performance of restoration, especially in fragile situations where sometimes you lose the target. Yeah, because there's a drought in one year, there's a flood in another year, there's a group of new displaced people coming into the communities. As things are on the move, much more unpredictable than in our more stable environments. And so the purpose can actually serve as a North Star and say, okay, we're muddling through for some time, but we know where we're going. And that North Star would have to be commonly agreed amongst all those parties contributing to ecosystem restoration. That would actually shift traditional decision-making, you know, that we are used to in organizations with a CEO or certain leadership or informal power that we have as researchers to purpose-driven choices. And I think it would, I can't go into details here, but it would fundamentally change the way we operate. We would align our decisions and the bigger choices we'd have to make much more with our core values. And these core values we'd have to share. Some of these things have to be negotiated in multi-actor partnerships, because as I said, private sector ticks very differently than a refugee or a displaced person can express current values. It's a decision-making that is much more adapted or adaptive, so to speak. It's adaptive management than following a log frame reforestation or afforestation program. And I think purpose-driven choices are, to offer you a definition, they are decisions aligned with the intrinsic motivation of people. Again, the answer to the why question. And it, as much as possible, prioritizes mid to long-term goals. Bearing in mind what I've just said, that how difficult it is. It brings people together around a collective mission of. I blurred that picture because this is one of. Don't have permission to share this, but this is one example where people come together over maps that ICRAF actually produces to discuss where different restoration priorities shall be fostered, and it's a negotiation process. It goes back and forth. What we do in these conversations often is to discuss targets. What kind of trees do you want? What kind of trees does the other person want? How many acres do we plant trees on? Do we need trees anyway? That's a question we hardly ask. And why do we plant those trees? That's the even bigger and more important question that we tend to forget. And that's what I would like to introduce to the conversation. There are a few indicators I thought about that helps us to maybe in future measure the degree of purposeness in a restoration initiative, consistency of leadership behavior with regard to the agreed purpose. It's one area, but then also the alignment of personal values as a researcher with the restoration initiative. The personal value of a household that Mary was talking about, or a family with the restoration initiative, of the government that may look at carbon sequestration in a quantifiable manner. These alignments need to be there. Peer and team behavior, impact-driven results, and the last one, transition-making transparency, as an indication of the purpose-drivenness of decisions we are making in such restoration activities. As I said at the beginning, I'm entering muddy terrain here. This is I'm basically sharing my thinking with you. That's why I don't have a conclusion. But there are knowledge gaps that I think, or at least questions that I have, because I may be totally on the wrong track, and maybe purpose isn't anything useful here. But I would like to look at 5 things. So the first one is really effectiveness. Does clarity of purpose and the making transparent to the others that particular purpose that we bring to the play, does it ease prioritization of tree species selection, for instance? And in what way does purpose help us to understand trade-offs better in decision making? And does it actually improve effectiveness? Are we doing things better if we align with a commonly agreed purpose? So that's number one. Secondly, does a purpose conversation, does it improve trust, social capital? Big question mark. Maybe it doesn't. I've put down three questions that are worth looking. Sustainability. Can a stronger purpose-drivenness actually take us beyond the typical project lifespan? Can it become something that runs for itself by refreshing the purpose constantly? Fourth, does it increase adaptive capacity? I think especially important in fragile situations, because the purpose could take us away from the log frame to some extent, as we already know where we're going, and we then are more flexible with at operational and tactical level. But this would also require we would have more flexible budgets to use. And number 5, ownership. Does it increase ownership of eventually everyone on the stage? And that includes the forest users. It includes us, the researchers. For the time we are on the stage, for the time we are working together, and beyond. So this is my thinking based on what I felt in conversations around ecosystem restoration, observations I made, conversations I've had at the moment in Somalia. I don't have a conclusion. I want to hear from you what you think about that. And if you found your purpose, tell me also. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. So I'd like to ask my fellow speakers to come and join me here for a small panel discussion. And we'll pick questions from the audience. So any questions from the audience?
Hi, my question, thanks for all your speeches. That was really nice. It's nice to hear all the good ideas. For Alex, right? Sorry. Yeah. The recovering professor. So I'm kind of an aspiring professor. I guess I do lectures at a university, and you gave very explicit, tragic story of agroecology missing from the process. I'm wondering if you could give us a story about how it's worked using an agroecology perspective to address landscape level issues. Good answer.
But he's gonna go around to more questions. Thanks. That's a powerful illustrative example, but we are still kind of really short and really life application of these, because it's just emerging. But what I see, what I was trying to present is that here's a clear example where there is tremendous opportunity to look at and take a landscape approach that also integrates kind of system level dynamic understanding, but also starts to strongly implicate government. So I think Africa is suffering from a legacy of dereliction of duty by governments. And it's because there is enormous inflow of resources and capacity that comes from global international organizations, plus organizations that are present in these countries. So the example that I gave, for example, is failed forest conservation and land use planning policies, just writ large. We've ignored tremendous opportunities to bring agroforestry into landscapes. We've ignored opportunities for just commonsensical land use planning and leave forests where they're supposed to be. For example, soil and water conservation at the farm level. And like I said, it's not for a lack of policies. We are up to the eyeballs with policy. We're drowning in policy. And the corridors of government are graveyards of unimplemented policies. So it implicates state incapacity. And what I was also suggesting is that there is also a tendency to drive too much to expert training, where you've got all these individuals with a lot of factoids in their heads, but they can't connect these to develop viable solutions to solve problems. And then this is the space that agroecology could come into in terms of transdisciplinary thinking, systems thinking, bringing community folk wisdom into understanding patterns and dynamics of landscapes, especially exacerbated by climate change. So if you take, for example, the case of extreme eutrophication in Lake Victoria, that is because of decimation of upland forests, and then bad fisheries management, for example, how do you start to bring these solutions into the discussion? So what I'm trying to look at is, what is the opportunity for us to insert more energetically kind of agroecological perspectives in all spheres that relate to land-based activities?
Thank you so much. Anyone else with a question?
Thank you very much. My question is for Mary. Two questions, but I think they're probably related. So one is if you could give us some examples of what you mean by inter-household approach. And secondly, is in your work, if you have considered including also the migrants in testing methodologies or showing that the benefits of agroecology? Yes.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so when we're talking about these intra-household approaches, something that we've been doing in Kenya are these community dialogues. So bringing communities together, men and women, to really have a critical discussion about how gender and social relations kind of impact their ability to engage with land restoration. And these are very interactive kind of workshops where we have role plays, men play women, women play men, they go through a negotiation, and they're really focused on how are things now and how would you like things to be. And I think they're really useful in initiating those discussions around how people engage in decision-making, why that might be, how they would like things to be. The point on engaging migrants, I think, is a really tricky one, especially if they're not there on the farms. So I think that's something we need to think very carefully about. Are there certain times of the year that people are more likely to be around? But also, are there ways that we can provide information that can then be shared in a very easy way? Yeah, so I think those are still challenges that we need to be thinking about, and how to design, communication products, or how to invite those people or encourage multiple house members to actually attend trainings.
Thank you so much. I'd like to pose a question to the audience. I see, I'll come to you later. Michael posed a very critical question in terms of, and also basing on all the 5 presentations. From your perspective, what do you feel are the most pressing knowledge gaps in understanding decision-making for fragile contexts, either in the work that you do or even based on the presentations that have been made? What is actually missing?
Now you're starting to feel how we feel when you ask us questions.
Yeah.
Any answers here?
Yeah.
I would like to have an answer to that, but I might push it back as a question, because when I see the title and it links to something that might be missing, I was wondering, is it the right sequence? And I come back to Robert Chandler's putting people first. So I would usually always start with people, but I heard from some of your aspirations that all points at that. So why don't you turn it around and ask, for instance, the role of trees and people's choices, or something like, we really take people, their livelihoods, their aspirations, I would add the motivation, the incentives they have to do things, not to do other things, as a starting point. And I'm pretty sure that gets us much more to wise restoration efforts fail altogether or not that successful. So my question is back to that. Is it missing that you're starting with the trees and rather than starting with people?
Open question to the panel.
Yeah, I think that an analogy that I might provide that resonates with your question is, if you got a hammer in your hands, what do you see? And you see nails. So how about if we start with exactly as you construct the problem? And I think I probably made some references to that with the point that I made about this middle-aged lady who said their problem was burying their dead. And we were so consumed about preserving and stopping the soil from getting into the ecology, which we thought that had this strong correlation with livelihood outcomes at the household level. So, and that's why I also said that there is a limit to the efficacy of science as solely applied as a singular way of understanding and interpreting the world. And we need to bring in other disciplines in helping to construct the problematic and situating the solution space in a people-centered way. That if we departed from that kind of more of an agnostic inquiry-based model, rather than having back pockets some pre-cooked, preordained solutions, it becomes enormously complicated, and we're incredibly biased because we have predetermined endpoints. I think that's an open challenge to us as a community to really step back from to uneducate ourselves a little bit, to say, wait a minute, maybe we don't know. in a sense. So I think that's a point very well taken.
Maybe also, I think, I mean, I fully agree. I think what we also need to do, or is maybe, I don't know if it's missing or if it's just like a challenge for us, is to kind of evolve our field a little bit. It often seems, I mean, what you're saying, we'll be coming in with a certain perspective and we realize, oh, that's not actually the problem. I think what we're missing as a community, maybe I think this is homework for everybody in this conference, is the ability to really kind of put ourselves into that particular context that we're working in, the challenges of development with their full complexity, and then also the paralysis that maybe comes with realizing that with these scientific techniques that we learned about in university, we're not going to be able to address this properly. I think that we need kind of upgrade of our education focus maybe, and like more towards ability not necessarily to apply certain statistical designs or whatever, but rather to grasp the complexity, the openness that requires the curiosity, the ability to hear different perspectives and somehow make sense of all of this. And then field the questions from all these technical scientists who confront us with the fact that this is not a proper research design. I mean, but I think we do have to become better at dealing with the complexity of like this messy situation that really developments happens in.
Thank you so much. I think we had a question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. It was super interesting. And I was thinking yesterday during the plenary, the question was about practical solutions, so how to move towards implementation. And I think that one element is also how projects are designed and what is the flexibility that you have to really ask what people want and then work to realize that how flexible our project, how get they designed, how inclusive is the design of research projects, and what are then the implications of all what we heard in the different presentations today on how to change the way in which we make things.
Yeah, I was just going to say, including the donors. I mean, so what she's talking about is this challenge of, well, if we want money, we have to write exactly what we're going to do. We have to know exactly who we are, what expertise we have, what the problem is, and then of course you end up in the situation where you realize, oops, the problem is not the problem I thought, and I have absolutely no idea of how to solve this problem. And then you end up doing this project for 3 years, 5 years. That's completely pointless, and you kind of knew it from day one. But I don't know, maybe you're lying to yourself. There, oh, it's all relevant. There are other designs, and I want to give a shout out here to Blay. There is at least one donor here that I'm sitting there right in the middle of the room. She's not paying attention, but she's here. Yeah. So there are some donors now that are moving towards kind of two-phase approaches, and I think that's really, really useful. You can have an exploratory phase. There's like sometimes 5 months funding or so. The pilot phase, you can have some workshops. You can make sure that you have the right partners, that you understand the problem, and you can actually add partners to your team that are needed to answer the questions that are really there. I think it's the exception, and like in the German Research Foundation, I think this is like unthinkable for this at the moment, but there are some promising signs in that direction. I think more and more donors are getting that idea that this is actually needed. Yeah, we need to be more adaptive, and we simply can't predict everything in day one. I hope that especially for projects in development spaces, that will become mainstream. Yeah, that you can have a plan. As Corey always likes saying, you can have a plan as something to deviate from. You can have a plan immediately, initially what you want to do, and then everything changes, and that should be accommodated by the structure of our funding. I think it would be really nice.
Okay. Michael, you have something to say?
Well, yeah, on the good news, I mean, there are more donors that fund inception phases also. And we are working with some of those. But the phase alone doesn't make the difference. I think what we do in that phase makes the difference. And that's why purpose-driven questions, or questions that bring up the deeper purpose, should also be asked in that phase, in my opinion. That requires what Alex, I would paraphrase with, a beginner's mindset. go in as you would never have heard about anything that's happening in that community. Go in with a beginner's mindset, and only then later make sense of it. Difficult, but I think useful.
Any other question? Yes, we have 2 more questions.
Want to build on what you just shared, and that is, in addition, I think putting people first is also the aspect of co-creation. Is that real? That means this initiation exploratory phase, yes, but also through the engagement that there's, if there is real co-creation, is learning and need for flexibility of what comes up, but it is of interest in pursuing. Thanks.
There was another question, comment, and go ahead.
Thank you very much for all the very nice presentation. Maybe mine is not exactly the question, but I want to share a little bit real experience from the grassroots. For the quick context, I'm from Indonesia, exactly from Aceh province. Previously, I'm European professor living from Unimon in agriculture and resource management. So I'm working with this kind of social forestry projects in Indonesia since 2016, and we are also working to build the recognition of local people, local knowledge aspiration. So how this local knowledge can really be there in the decision making. So by the end of the day, they will never lose their purpose in participating in this sustainable forest management. But what really made me frustrating is, for example, after all these years of funding mostly from the international donors, like what I did before, 3 years from European Union, we are working with this project of social forestry in Aceh. But then after the project is ended, and we made many of the local knowledge products, for example, like policy brief and books and video and many others that talking about the local knowledge of these local people to manage their forests, to protect the forest conservation and etc. But the governments, the official that really be the decision makers in this case, never put the crucial points of these beneficiaries in the degree. For example, they selected what really important for them and what that's too necessary. But the main thing is that there's this stigma when the governments never feel to give the real recognition, because the local people, they never see them as a well educated enough to present their local knowledge. For example, in the social forestry project, the Indonesian government give the local communities 35 years to manage their forests. But there is this kind of, after 5 years, if there's nothing to do in this forest area, the government can take it back, the degree, the access to manage this protected forest. But what we can do in these 5 years, what if the facilitator, the NGO, the government cannot really bring these people to maximize their activities in the forest? They lose the time. And at the end, there's nothing really be there for them after 10 years, for example, because, for example, this program already ran from 2016 in Indonesia itself. 99 degree, more than 20,000 households involved. But yeah, it's never be really for their immediate needs, or maybe to protect the forest or their food system, because yeah, it's frustrating because in the paper, in the official paper, what they really need, what they're really, the real aspiration from these beneficiaries never be there. How, my question is, maybe in your experience, like Mary in Kenya, how can we really guarantee this aspiration be there during the decision making? Maybe Professor Ludwig, you can give some more information so that as the facilitator, as the NGO, people working in NGO, we can say to them that we're working with you, we be there until the end, and we make sure that it's our work together. Thank you.
Maybe you have a response to that? Yeah, I mean, based on Michael's presentation, I think some of the things that you've been working on probably speaks very well. Yes. To sure. Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the things that we have been talking around, you know, bringing people together to have a shared vision, shared purpose, is really important. I mean, in the situation you described, it sounds like the real challenges are the time periods, right? That lack of recognition that to actually make those changes and see the benefits can take a long time. And that's the case with forestry, agroforestry. That's one of the constraints that we're working with. And I guess this kind of links back maybe to those constraints of projects being quite short term as well. Yeah, anyone else have anything?
I just want to add that, you know, there's increasing currency in the multi-stakeholder approach to these kinds of questions. I think one of the kind of critical audit process questions we ought to ask ourselves is, do we have everybody around the table? And how do we allocate and enforce accountability by public institutions in these discussions? You know, the example that you give is pretty shocking, that the government gives you 35 years and they could revoke that decree in 5 years if they think that you're not. But what is the role of government in there? And how does preserving a forest speak directly to the immediate aspirations of local communities in terms of their food needs, cultural rights, aesthetics, and also the other elements that forests provide in terms of spiritual and even health, form of health-seeking behavior types with resources in the forest that have healing capabilities. So I think how do you construct these kind of nested hierarchies of engagement and accountabilities that then lead to critical outcomes that are important? We believe a bottom line is livelihoods and human prosperity. You know, we don't exist for trees, for example, but how do we make sure that we construct a trajectory that lines up human well-being outcomes with actions and behaviors that benefit and enable biodiversity that is critical to supporting our well-being?
Maybe I do have some thoughts today. I think when it comes to these government processes and decision-making processes, I think we maybe sometimes have to invest a little bit more in understanding how these decisions are actually made, who makes them, what they want, what their ambitions are, how much power they have, and also, actually, many of you may have missed a nice poster presentation by Zhang this morning over there on stakeholder mapping for decision-making in Vietnam. Yeah? I think we should look at kind of the landscape of stakeholders that are out there, different organizations maybe, look at what they want, how much power they have possibly, and see if we can define a constellation that helps us nudge government into the right direction. Yeah, I mean, obviously, if the community has certain ambitions and certain purpose, but nobody listens to them because they're not considered credible or powerful enough, then maybe there needs to be somebody who fills that space in the stakeholder landscape and the decision influencing landscape. Can be an international NGO, but then maybe we should incentivize such an organization to reach out to the government and lobby there. Yeah, but I mean, thinking about how the decision-making process works, I think can really help us be much more influential than if we just focus on generating our evidence and then being frustrated that nobody takes us seriously enough, which is often the pathway that doesn't totally connect with real world in practice.
Our package providing the right decision.
Our package?
Finding the right decision.
Oh, yeah. One of that.
It's very interesting. I just wanted to add that Alex mentioned that there is a whole heap of policies that are well-meaning but not implemented. So I'm wondering if also too often when things go badly, we blame bad policies, while we also know that all the good policies are not implemented. So is it actually sensible to focus on these policies that are maybe misaligned? Or to what extent do they actually matter for the outcome we want to achieve? Is it actually the easiest avenue or the best avenue anyway to achieve anything? I don't know if you model that ever. But otherwise, somebody else in the room can download this hackathon.
Thank you. We have time for one more final question. Oh, three more. Oh, wow. Okay, all right. The last three. Yeah, go ahead.
Last four.
Thank you for a very informative presentation. Just responding to the question you asked about gap, what do you think is missing? My thinking is inability to include historical contexts of their fragile situations, because whatever led to them being in that way, there was some motivations or something that happened. And the reason why that might be important is that farming is increasingly leaving the hands of the old towards the hand of the young ones, who now will be farming with phones. And that might be a little bit complex. So having those historical context would be important in decision making. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we will collect all the comment, I think there were three people or four? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, all of them together, and then we'll make comments together. Yeah.
So my question really connects to the presentations for and Michael. We talked a lot about aspirations and purpose-driven choices, and I wondered how you would approach people, or that's also something that I want to mention. I feel like often people in villages, for example, are approached as one community, but there are always power imbalances and certain power dynamics that, for example, make it difficult for people to speak up, or they are too afraid to even say anything. And I wonder, how do you deal with that when you want to have purpose-driven decision making?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I actually want to have a comment. My name is Nang, and I'm also from the same group with ICRAF modeling. And I have a comment on the system change aspect that you have mentioned, that actually we need a change from all different actors, including donors. And it's very nice that now there are more donors who are flexible in the way of designing the proposal. And also they are more involved in engaging stakeholders. I just want to share that, like, before I did my PhD at the University of Bonn, I worked in development context. And one of the things I fear the most, both in development and research, is really about the monitoring indicators. Because I think in many cases we set the indicators, but actually we never achieve that. Or we achieve that in the way that maybe it's just a way that we make it easy to achieve. And I really think that, like, we do need to set indicators, but many indicators would make us try to pick the easy handling foods, or try to fish for the success. And we lack the critical thinking throughout the process. And I think that is really, to me, it's not a healthy way of monitoring. We lose a chance to learn from the people. And it's both, in my experience, I see it both in the research and development context. And I really think that, like, with the requirement of all main core proposal, I really hope that we need to also adapt the way we monitor the indicators in the way that it can reflect the complexities and also the flexibility.
Last question. because was it you? Yeah, you can give it to her. Yeah.
Sorry, I want to build up a comment following from that and the previous comment on seed inception report phase. So I've also run a project and then I realized that the inception report phase is so important because it's going to be the bridge between the international researcher and local researchers and help us to understand a lot more the local context and have to build the indicator as well, which also need to change also from the funding structure or like the on how we run the project and design the project. And for me, my personal experience, opinions on what is needed as entry point on training structure is field visit is a must, so we can engage those conversations. And then the component between junior and senior researcher is also needed. And there are components between international and local research, because at the end, the local is going to stay. And local researcher can engage with other parties to continue to work on that. But yeah, emphasize again on inception report is so important before we can design a project for 5 years, 7 years.
Thank you so much. Am I locking out anyone from this side for the question? Yes? Okay, all right. Yes, we'll come to you.
Yeah, also from my side, I think that's Michael, right? When you were having the presentation, which I found very insightful, my first association was, oh, now someone is talking about spirituality and religion, because, you know, especially outside Europe, it is such an important component of people's lives. But you were only considering, like, recording organizations, policymakers, research, and I'm wondering, why do you exclude this, like, I don't know, spiritual community, religious leaders, as being like important players in purposes, you know, like, you know what I mean, right?
I'm not sure.
So Michael, you can start with this. There was a question about power imbalances and
I can't do all of them. Yeah, Kai, you do the Alex, I think it was you, Alex, no? You mentioned something about getting the stakeholders on board. So or the actors, everyone who need to be at the table should be at the table. So, or certainly religious leaders, clan elders, spiritual personalities, whoever. No? Yes. So I'm not ruling those or excluding them at all. Yeah. It's up to the stakeholder assessment actually that would decide on that. And then how to go about it very practically. I think first acknowledge that there's a great deal of heterogeneity in our organizations and communities, and the purpose varies. You talk to people, you get two different responses. Second, enable people to identify their purpose, to connect with it. Certainly make sure that they're able to share it with the others. No, and Dietmar, who left already, asked that kind of jump on our title, wanted to change the words. He referred to chambers and the entire literature on Farmer First, Beyond Farmer First, participatory literature. There's plenty of tools in there that one can actually use. Yeah.
I think one first step in addressing these power imbalances is also just to be able to verbalize these different types of aspirations that are out there and then think about how they connect later on. I'm not sure if it's always intentional that these more powerful are heard more. I think it's the lack of awareness in many cases as well. So once we have that information, that can actually overcome quite a bit, and then part of the answer then could be to set the indicators at a different level and by different people to then measure our progress against what those people want rather than our own predefined sets. Sure. Also, we have 3 minutes over.
Yes. Final thoughts, Kai, just very briefly as we go around. Final thoughts, final points.
I think that was a pretty solid final thought.
All right. I think final
I'm too hungry for final thoughts. But it's nice to see such a lively community and actually such an also insightful panel. I think we're all realizing how complex the world is and how important it is to actually confront that fact and not like stick to our somewhat reductionist scientific approach that we kind of used to, and more open up to the challenges of doing meaningful research in that complicated space that this world offers for us.
Just to echo what I say, this has been an extraordinarily insightful conversation, both from the panel presenters and from you, the audience. And I hope that we can continue this discussions outside, in this conference for our meetings.
Okay, thanks. I think maybe my takeaway is around, we've been talking about purpose-driven aspirations, but maybe some of that isn't so new, but the constraints are maybe around how research is funded, and there's other structures as well. So maybe people outside of this room also speak about that conversation.
I think we've all earned tea, coffee, a cup of water, an apple, a piece of bread.
And with those thoughts, I'd like to end this session. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your everything. Thank you to
Happy I got this session. It was good.
Thank you for helping me live the running around.